All right, what's going on, everyone? Ran a poll a couple months ago that we're following up on here. So, asked what conflicts outside of Ukraine and Russia should get more coverage than they do. The winner was the Mexican drug war, followed by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then the Yemeni civil war. So, we're going to dive into a couple of those here and in the follow-on video. Today, we're going to focus on ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, and the following video, which should come out tomorrow, will be focused on the Mexican drug war and Afghanistan. I've been trying to catch up on Myanmar. Honestly, it's been a very difficult conflict for me to fully understand. So hopefully once I get a little more of that under my belt, we can bring that into the mix here as well. Now, these summary type videos on these conflicts are not designed to be like any sort of breaking news. Depending on the conflict, there's not as much coverage as we're seeing in Ukraine, which means there aren't as many sources, not as easy to vet the information coming out. So all of it is going to be about a week behind. That gives us enough time to make sense of what has happened and see, in some cases, the other side of the story come out before presenting it here. So this little update here will be focused on the week of 12 to 18 November. All right, starting out on November 15th in the Arabian Sea off the coast of Oman, Iran launched one of their Shahed 136 drones that we're seeing a lot of in Ukraine. That struck an Israeli-owned tanker, caused minimal damage, no injuries, but the belief is that that drone was launched from Shah Bahar, listed here on this map. These drones are kind of slow cruise missiles, depending on exactly how they're classified. They've been getting a lot of attention, again, in Ukraine, but they're not that new. They were rolled out about a year ago. They've been used so far during the war in Yemen, and it makes sense that we're going to start seeing these used more and more by Iran. They're very cheap to manufacture, and even though they have a relatively small payload, they can hit a target out past 2,000 kilometers, which is pretty substantial range. Moving back to that strike, it took place just a couple hours after the U.S. announced the seizure of explosive materials on a ship that was headed from Iran to Yemen. The U.S. seized 100 tons of fertilizer and 70 tons of ammonium perchlorate, which officials said could be used to fuel more than a dozen medium-range ballistic missiles. These seizures have been going on for a while. It's nothing really all that new. And there have been some pictures of Iranian-made weapons showing up with Ukrainian forces, and there's speculation that those might be captured arms that Iran is shipping to Yemen that over time make their way, some way, shape, or form, to the battlefields in Ukraine. Now, the primary external backers for the war in Yemen is Saudi Arabia and Iran. So we'll get more into that conflict here in just a second. But if you look at how those two countries have to deliver arms and aid to Yemen, you can see why there's quite a bit of the Iranian shipments being seized. Saudi Arabia can go directly overland. They share a border with Yemen. But Iran has to shift around through the Gulf of Oman, through the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and there's multiple places for them to be interdicted. Continuing on with the Yemen war, on November 17th, Houthi forces conducted a test launch of an anti-ship missile from Sana'a Governorate, which fell into the international waters on the Red Sea, marked here on the map on the left-hand side. The internationally recognized government, or IRG, of Yemen, that the Houthis are fighting against, accused the IRGC, that's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, of being involved in facilitating and helping to execute that launch, which isn't crazy. Getting back to the two sides' backers, the IRG, the internationally recognized government backed by Saudi Arabia, the Houthis backed by Iran. Continuing on with Yemen, fighting increased pretty significantly all across the country last week, with clashes between Houthi and IRG forces on fronts around Taiz City and between Houthi and Southern Transitional Council affiliated forces in the south of the governorate. Finally, clashes also increased in the northwestern and southern fronts, where Houthi forces targeted IRG forces with drones. So similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine, this is one conflict where both sides have been pretty effective at using drones throughout this war. All right, moving on to Syria, maybe the most confusing conflict of all. There's so many factions involved in this fighting, and it hasn't really gotten easier over time. Anyways, over the course of the last week, Islamic State attacks against pro-regime militias, pro-Iran militias, and regime forces in the deserts of Deir ez-Zor and Al-Raqqa more than doubled. The reporting as of now is that those individual fights resulted in the deaths of 5 regime fighters and 6 pro-Iranian militia fighters. Meanwhile, local gunmen, so kind of a local militia supported by regime forces, clashed with Islamic State militants in Dara for the 3rd consecutive week. That fighting resulted in the deaths of supposedly 11 Islamic State members. Technically, during the time period we're covering here, November 12th through 18th, Turkish activity in the northern part of Syria, the Kurdish-held regions, decreased, but that picked up pretty quickly when President Erdogan said Turkey will launch a Syria ground operation after strikes are complete, and the reason for that we'll get into here in a second. As you can see from this map here that was pulled on November 25th, there were quite a few Turkish strikes all across the Kurdish-held area of Syria. This is outside of the window we're going to talk about, but it's happening pretty quick, so I wanted to make sure we at least brought it up here. And the reason for these strikes we'll get into here in a moment. On November 13th, a bomb was detonated in Istanbul, which reportedly killed 6 Turkish civilians and wounded 81. This was the deadliest attack in Istanbul since a twin suicide bombing carried out by the Kurdistan Freedom Hawks in 2016 that killed 44, and Turkish police identified and arrested a Syrian woman as the perpetrator, claiming that she was a PKK agent, and blamed the attack on the group and their Syrian affiliates. Worth noting, the PKK denied that accusation, but that is why we see an uptick in Turkish attacks on Syria and a lot of talk that Turkey might follow it up with some sort of ground offensive in the coming weeks, days, or months. In Iraq, the Iranian IRGC conducted cross-border strikes targeting Kurdish militant groups in the northern part of the country, which reportedly killed 2 fighters. The IRGC accused these groups of smuggling weapons into Iran and threatened a ground operation should the Iraqi government fail to secure the border between Iran and Iraqi Kurdistan. So it's not really anything new that the Kurds are being threatened from multiple directions, but it has picked up quite a bit in the last few weeks, with Iran and Turkey now suggesting they might resort to some sort of ground operation into Kurdish-held territory. In Iran, nationwide demonstrations increased significantly over the last week. Again, we're talking November 12th through 18th. More and more of those demonstrations turned violent. The statistic from that week, November 12 through 18, is at least 4 Iranian civilians were killed. However, when we get to this next week, I think that number is going to be substantially higher. Elsewhere in Iran, police violence against ethnic Kurds increased in Kurdistan province, where police reportedly killed 3 civilians. This violence triggered clashes between Kurdish rioters and police in Kurdistan and West Azerbaijani provinces, and reportedly resulted in the death of 8 more people. Moving on to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Last week in Palestine, 1 Palestinian and 3 Israelis were killed during separate attacks on the West Bank. And on November 14th, Israeli forces opened fire towards a Palestinian car during an overnight operation, reportedly killing a 15-year-old girl and injuring the driver. The soldiers claimed to have shot the car after the driver accelerated towards them when they signaled him to stop. However, Palestinian media disputes their claim and maintains that the car slowed down. Finally, on November 15th, a Palestinian with no clear political affiliation carried out a stabbing and a car ramming attack, reportedly killing 3 Israeli soldiers and injuring another 4 before being shot dead by off-duty soldiers and armed settlers. The attack sparked a series of violent demonstrations involving Israeli settlers across the West Bank last week. That'll do it for now. Just kind of a 10,000-foot view of a couple of these conflicts, a lot of them happening in the Middle East. As a reminder, next one up, video will come out tomorrow, should come out tomorrow, is going to be focused on the Mexican drug war as well as what's going on in Afghanistan. We'll see y'all next time.